Right around the corner is our next IPC Stoneheart, which is going to be the limited quantum erudition character, Jade. Now coming off Firefly, who was a character fighting for the top DPS spot in the game, and eventually our previous IPC character, who is arguably our best sustain in the game, Jade has some big expectations to live up to. Now luckily it's looking pretty much all but confirmed she will absolutely reach these expectations in pure fiction, but unfortunately most likely fall short in other scenarios. And in today's video we're going to run through all of that so you know what to expect from her and you can maybe make a decision on whether you want to pull her. Okay, before we run through how strong she is and all that, let's quickly go through Jade's kit for those of you who don't know what she does. Jade is another follow-up attack focus unit, making it 3 for 3 for our IPC Stoneheart characters. She isn't a main DPS like ratio, although she can be played in it potentially, and we'll talk about that later, but she's going to be most geared towards being a sub DPS follow-up attacker. Her basic attack is surprisingly not a stock standard one, but actually does blast damage, so it's going to be our first AoE basic attack in the game. Her skill targets an ally, giving them up to 30 speed, and assigning them the role of being the debt collector. Whenever this debt collector attacks, they generate stacks for Jade's follow-up, which I'll explain right after this, but it also drains the ally's HP and deals an additional quantum hit based on Jade's attack. Now the way Jade's follow-up works is she has a stack counter that goes all the way up to 8. Whenever Jade or the ally she has marked, so her debt collector, attacks an enemy, she gains stacks based on how many enemies are hit. When this counter gets to 8, she will launch her full AoE follow-up. So basically, if Jade has her skill on a character like Herder, when Herder uses her skill and it hits 5 enemies, Jade will gain 5 stacks on her follow-up. Now Jade will also gain these stacks on her own attacks, which is why it's super important that her basic attack is AoE. So whenever Jade has a turn and she uses her basic attack, she's always going to give herself 3 stacks for her follow-up. Now her talent also states that whenever she launches a follow-up, she's going to gain separate stacks, with each one giving her crit damage and attack percent. And finally her ultimate. Jade's ultimate is very similar to Topaz's. It enhances 2 of her follow-up attacks, but it also comes with an initial nuke that will do full AoE damage. Okay, well as primarily a sub DPS character, it's important to understand which characters Jade is going to play really well with. Looking at her kit, it's going to be fairly obvious. Jade is going to like characters that have a lot of AoE hits in their kit, so that's going to include pretty much all our erudition characters as well as Blade, because Blade does have a decent amount of AoE, but also more importantly, the HP drain on Jade's skill actually triggers Blade's follow-up. Okay, let's go over the positives of her kit so far. Well, addressing the title of the video, it's all but confirmed that Jade will be an absolute god in pure fiction, and probably the best pure fiction character we have in the game as of now. If you pair her with pretty much any erudition character, Jade is going to be able to trigger her follow-up a lot in these pure fiction fights. For example, with let's say Herder, once Herder presses her skill, that is 5 stacks instantly. If that manages to trigger Herder's own follow-up, that's going to be another 5 stacks that goes to Jade. Now I didn't mention this before, but Jade's follow-up stacks can actually overcap. So if for example she is at 7 out of 8 and Herder hits 5 targets, she will then go to 12 out of 8 and retain those 4 extra stacks for building her next follow-up. Basically with someone like Herder who has a lot of AoE in their kit and even has their own follow-up which is AoE, Jade is going to be able to trigger her follow-up a lot and easily be able to clear through those waves. In Jade's best pure fiction team, which is going to be something like Herder, Jade, Robin, and a sustain, this team is probably going to easily be able to 40k, and you might even see people achieving 0 cycles in pure fiction, which is absolutely not necessary, but it really just flexes how strong Jade is. Even with weaker pure fiction characters, so maybe you want to use Herder on the other team, which is probably the smarter move anyway, Jade is most likely going to be able to carry one side of pure fiction by herself, as long as her debt collector does reasonable amounts of AoE damage. Now before we run through Jade's performance in other game modes, let's quickly run through how she performs as a hypercarry. If Jade presses her skill on herself, she does not get the speed buff, but she does now give herself extra stacks. So previously when Jade does a basic attack, it hits 3 targets and gives herself 3 follow-up stacks. If she makes herself the debt collector, when she does a basic attack, it'll now give her 6 stacks instead of 3. This means even as a hypercarry, Jade will still be able to trigger her follow-up a reasonable amount. Now you also have the option of using this debt collector buff on a support character. Someone like Pella, who has a full AoE in her ult and spends the rest of her time either basic attacking or skilling, will be able to generate a reasonable amount of stacks for Jade, and they're also going to be able to make use of that 30 speed buff. You just need to make sure that the support support you use the debt collector buff on is someone who actually attacks. So for someone like Sparkle, while that 30 speed buff does sound really nice for her, she spends every turn using her skill and her ult does not attack the enemies, so she's not going to generate any stacks for Jade. For Hypercarry Jade, we're definitely going to need to test it a bit more once she actually releases, but it still will probably be decent in Pure Fiction just because she's so good in the game mode, but it also isn't what Jade is designed for, and she's always going to perform a lot better with a secondary DPS character in the team. Okay, Jade is sounding pretty amazing right now. But now we're going to have to talk about the other game modes where unfortunately Jade is going to see quite a big performance drop. Jade is pretty much tailor-made for Pure Fiction. She ideally needs her debt collector to hit 5 targets so they can generate a lot of stacks for Jade herself so she can do her follow-up all the time. If you are able to do this, then Jade is going to be a really strong character. But unfortunately, this kind of situation is only consistent in Pure Fiction. In MOC, most of the time, we see 4 to 5 units at the start, normally 2 elite enemies, and then a few add-ons or a warp trotter next to them. At this stage of the fight, Jade is still going to be pretty good since there's a lot of units on the field. But normally as the fight goes on, those weaker enemies on the side get killed off by the AoE damage of Jade or the other DPS, and then you're stuck with just 2 elites on the field. Once there's 2 elites, Jade will only be getting 2 stacks every time her teammate or herself attacks the enemies, which is going to require 4 attacks to get a single follow-up. The same thing happens against a boss enemy. Normally bosses do have their summons, so we have Yanqing with his swords, Argenti with his shield things, and then the deer also summons those plants. But because of Jade's AoE damage, those summons will be killed off a lot earlier than the actual boss, and once the boss is just stuck there by themselves, you're getting a single stack for Jade's follow-up every time there's an attack. This means you're waiting for 8 attacks to get a single follow-up out of Jade. Now, Jade has a way to kind of bypass this with her E1, which basically just gives her more stacks when there's less enemies on the field, and even lets her be able to play with hunt characters. And if you really want to make your Jade useful in these lower target situations that you might come across in MOC, E1 is genuinely a pretty good investment option for Jade. But if we're looking at the free-to-play, so E0 Jade, which most people are going to be working with, Jade is not going to perform that well in most situations in MOC. And then for Apocalyptic Shadow, it's going to be mostly the same. From what we've seen so far, it is mainly a boss fight. The bosses do summon their add-ons, which will help Jade trigger her follow-up more, but it is mainly focused on breaking the boss target, which is not Jade's specialty at all. Now, it's important to understand there's nothing wrong with everything we've gone through so far. It's perfectly fine to be a character that specializes in a single game mode. Before Apocalyptic Shadow came out, hunt characters were pretty much unplayable in Pure Fiction, so they were already cut out of half the game modes we had. So Jade being not that great in MOC, but being insanely strong in Pure Fiction is perfectly fine. Jade is still going to be a great character, but if you're thinking of pulling her, especially from a meta perspective, it's important to think about whether you really need the help in Pure Fiction. From what I've seen online, a lot of people tend to look at Pure Fiction as the easier game mode, and I can definitely understand why. We have characters like Herder, Himeko that a lot of players have, with Herder everyone having, and they're really good at clearing Pure Fiction. And unless you're just purely pulling hunt characters, your other team can normally pull through. So if you are one of those people who think Pure Fiction is ridiculously easy with what you have in your account, Jade is probably not going to be a really good pull for you unless you just really want to play her and you really like her kit. For me personally, I do really like Jade's kit, and especially because she does have some synergy with Blade, which we'll talk about right after this, but I also struggle a little bit in Pure Fiction. My Herder and Himeko are kind of trash. I only recently properly invested in them, so having a character like Jade be able to carry one side to an easy 40k is going to be really helpful. Okay, let's talk about that synergy with Blade. So whenever Jade's debt collector attacks, they actually drain their own HP, which works with Blade's follow-up attack. Every single attack Blade does is going to drain his own HP as long as Jade has the debt collector buff on him, which means he's going to be able to trigger his follow-up a lot more often in fights. Blade is also a relatively good AoE unit. His ult and his basic are blast attacks, but his follow-up is going to be full AoE, which is going to help Jade quite a lot as well. Jade's 30 speed buff is also going to help Blade be able to play with HP boots while also being speed tuned with Bronya. If you have your Blade at 105 speed, which is achievable without speed boots, you're going to be able to push him to 135, and you can have your Bronya at 134, so you're going to have that speed tuned setup while having HP boots on Blade. So every time your Blade goes, he's going to do a basic attack, which gives two stacks actually, because of Jade's debt collector. Bronya brings him forward, and then he does another basic attack, and that's another 2 stacks. So basically, every time Blade goes for a turn, he's going to get a minimum of 4 stacks from Jade's skill. I can say for pretty much certain that Jade and Blade plus Bronya, or even Ranmei, is going to be Blade's absolute best pure fiction team. Mainly just because his follow-up is going to be triggered quite a lot now, and Jade is also just there doing an insane amount for the team. In MOC and Apocalyptic Shadow, we're going to have to see. Jade is, as we said before, a decent bit weaker in these game modes. Blade is also not on the stronger side of DPS characters in the game so far. So in my opinion, and we're gonna have to see, and I could be completely wrong, but I think in Apocalyptic Shadow and MOC, the Blade Jade duo will only be slightly better, or maybe just on par with Blade's existing hypercarry teams right now. But this duo probably has decent potential to perform better than Blade's hypercarry. For example, on the second half of MOC right now, we have those 3 boss enemies that are pretty much all the same HP. Now obviously they aren't win weak and they're more focused on break damage, but in a scenario like that, there's always going to be 3 enemies on the field until you win the fight. So Jade is still going to be able to stack her follow-up a relatively decent amount. Basically, just to summarize, if you're thinking of pulling Jade, before we even go into any of that, if you really want her and if you like her kit, and I do think her kit is one of the coolest ones they've had in the game, just pull her. Don't listen to what I have to say or any content creator. All 5-star characters are going to perform fine in at least one scenario, with Jade obviously being pure fiction. However, if you are a bit on the fence, basically, if you want some help in pure fiction, Jade is going to be perfect for that. If you want more options for your Blade teams in pretty much all game modes, Jade is also going to be a good option for that. But other than that, with the character cast we have in the game currently, that's pretty much all we have for Jade to work with. So if you don't fit into either of those categories, Jade is probably not going to be the best meta pull for you. And if you couldn't tell from the video, my voice is almost completely gone, but we are in the recovery phase. I just came off being sick for quite a while, which is also why I've been kind of quiet on the YouTube videos lately. But now that I'm kind of getting back into it, we will go back to the older schedule of 2 to 3 videos every week. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think about Jade's kit and whether you're going to be pulling for her. Feel free to check out my Discord server as well, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed or found the video helpful. And that's pretty much all from me, and I'll see you guys next time.